And welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Wednesday, October 13th. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. Many of the stories read here can also be found at our website at IndianCountryNews.com. And here are some of the news stories for the day from the Associated Press and other Native news sources. A tribal police officer for the Cheyenne River Reservation, who was reportedly killed in the line of duty over the weekend, has passed away from the car crash. Police say Merrill Bruguier was killed on Saturday morning in a one-vehicle accident at the junction of South Dakota Highway 63 and U.S. Highway 212. Authorities are still investigating the crash. Police Lieutenant Chad Olson said Brewer worked for the department for 14 years. Several members of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders were attending the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement's 9th Annual Native Hawaiian Convention. The initiative's executive director, Kareem Ohaja, was the scheduled keynote speaker at a luncheon on October 12th. Other members will be speaking to attendees and holding various sessions with them. The convention runs through October 14th at the Hawaii Convention Center. This year's theme is Building on Greatness, Sovereignty in Action. The mission of the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement is to enhance the well-being of Hawaiians through the cultural, economic, and community development of Native Hawaiians. And today we talk briefly with Shoshone Bannock tribal member Mark Trahant about his latest column at marktrahant.com and about his observation that government does create jobs, should create jobs, and should create the capability to influence the potential future of jobs through investment in the country's infrastructure and on Indian reservations.
Mark Trahant, in your latest column here, you wrote that government jobs are essential. And in Indian country, we can always use jobs, and through the stimulus program, there were jobs. What do you mean by all this? Government jobs are necessary.
Well, if you right now, one of the writing strands of discourse in this election is that government doesn't create jobs, and I'm making the case that that's just not true, and especially places like rural communities, Indian reservations, and others where government has always created jobs. It's part of the process. From where I sit, I can look out and see a convenience store, casino, gas station, all of them government jobs, tribal government jobs.
Isn't there a much larger impact on government jobs, whether it's Indian reservations or the Conservation Corps from years ago, which did a lot of agricultural work? If I remember, there was a tremendous stimulus program involved in putting the freeway system together. Is there anything comparable to that nowadays?
Oh, right now, no. But I mean, you're right. The history of the region and virtually the country is investment by government and things like that, whether it be dams or aerospace, or silicon. I mean, we think about the wild, wild days of Silicon Valley, but that too started with government investment in government jobs. That's probably the most recent is Silicon Valley.
Can there be anything? Well, tell me what the connection to government jobs in Silicon Valley is. How do you see that connection?
It was research money plugged into universities. Basically, through that was and the ideas came out of that. I mean, the transistor was started back in the 50s as a Department of Defense process. It got taken over as Japanese figured out that it could be a commercial vehicle, and then we took it back and reinvented it again. But the roots of it are deeply in government technology.
I'm hearing people talk about the potential for things like light rail. They're talking about extending broadband. In this country, our rates of upload and download is dismal compared to countries like Japan and several other European countries where the upload-download is 10 times what we're doing. Do you see anything like that as comparable and effective that not only for the country, but what does Indian country need in terms of infrastructure?
Oh, I think the two you just mentioned for Indian country, well, we probably don't have the numbers for light rail, but certainly for broadband. And there are a lot of ways to accomplish that. And it would by a relatively small investment, create jobs down the road, because then people could tap into it, starting, say, news from Indian country television stations on broadband. That opportunity would create other opportunities. One of the things we're facing now is, as particularly if the Republicans take both the House and the Senate, is this big rollback of government. And I think it's important to know the implications of that, which boil down to a decrease of spending generally, which would affect all of us as fewer and fewer dollars are put into the economy.
Indeed. Again, it seems like the Democrats are getting squeezed between people who are saying there's too much spending and people who are critical of the fact that they're saying that the stimulus wasn't enough. How do you stimulate, and where do you stimulate at the same time that you're budget cutting? You're simply,
it's hard. Yeah.
You're going in both directions.
Right. Economist Joseph Stiglitz was on CNBC this morning, and he's pretty much been right about this entire crisis. And he thinks governments are potentially plunging directly into deflation because they're not spending enough. And he said without the current stimulus spending, the attitude is it doesn't give us enough. But he said without that, we'd be looking at 14, 15% unemployment, not 9%. And he thinks it worked. It didn't work enough, but it worked.
Typically, when we talk about the economy, we talk about inflation, increasing prices. And in this case, you're talking about deflation, the decreasing of prices. Is there something fundamentally wrong with deflation in a capitalistic economy? And let me ask this blunt question. Why would anyone on the reservation care? They barely, a lot of people say they just don't necessarily feel the impact of the recession. Some people have come home, but on the reservation, people are used to 10% unemployment. So either it's inflation or deflation. There seems to be less concern about the economy around them than ever before. But tell me a little bit about the difference between inflation and deflation, just for people like me that don't understand it.
You're right. Deflation is basically prices falling. And we're led in this one by what's called asset deflation. And that's things like houses are worth less than they were, significantly worth less than they were. How does that impact folks on the reservation? Well, it makes it harder to create jobs because capital is harder to raise. The absolute worst thing that can happen to you in a deflationary environment is have debt. And so how many people have debt? You pay back the debt at dollars that are worth more than what you borrowed them at. Whereas with inflation, it's just the opposite. You pay back the loan with dollars that are worth less. So if you owe a lot of money, inflation's a good thing. And the United States owes a lot of money, corporations owe a lot of money, and individuals owe a lot of money. So you can see just from that how profound the impact of deflation could be.
Well, that's interesting because, again, like I say, it seems like we have such, generally speaking, isolated economies on the reservation. It tended to be that money would come in and bleed out. Only now in the last decade do we see some of that bouncing around among some of the enterprises that have been built within the infrastructure. The future of tribes, if they were going to be talking about government jobs, what would you like to see tribes invest in?
Things that create jobs over the long haul. Casinos have been a great boon for almost every reservation, but it's not the kind of long-term job creation. If you could just take 10, 15% of that profit and turn it into things that are good long-term. I think investing in education, tribal colleges is probably one of the smartest. Expanding that, expanding access to high school to get young people ready for college. As the economy becomes more and more of what they call a knowledge economy, we've got to get people ready for college. People who go to college, unlike my generation even, are going to be facing a serious setback in terms of what they can do.
You said one time healthcare was an area that people should be investing in.
Absolutely.
And there was one other thought, digital technology. Is there any reason that any tribe shouldn't be plunging in, tremendous, I would say from my point of view, just because we're working with digital technology, 75% of all our efforts should be focused on the potential of digital technology, assuming that the broadband network and the internet is going to meet the reservation at some point and succeed with this infrastructure buildup.
I think that's a great example. The Courte tribe has been very interesting in that regard. They've basically created a broadband company to serve reservation people. And so they deliver internet, television channels. They have their own channel. They've basically said, we're not going to let outside companies control this mechanism. We're going to do it and make a profit along the way. But it also does another thing. It keeps costs low so that people can access this technology inexpensively.
All right, Mark. Well, it's interesting talking to you. We'll talk to you again maybe next week on another totally unknown subject to us. Appreciate you checking in. The elections are coming up. They're getting pretty interesting in terms of some of the polling. It looks like the Republicans are going to pull off some kind of a success here. The question is, what are the numbers going to be?
Right. Well, and I'm headed to Alaska next week, so I might be able to give you a special report on that.
We'll look forward to that, Mark. Thanks for joining with us again today.
Okay, we'll see you.
And that is the latest roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update. We want to thank you for joining with us today. Come back again soon. Miigwech.